From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
Hey guys, I left a message earlier about the Freedom Convoy. It obviously wasn't very good. I was a little nervous, so I've written a little script. But I give it a second whirl. Here goes. Hey guys, Canadian Trooper here. Just calling to say that I love the show and see if you guys are interested in covering the Freedom Convoy up here in Canada. If you don't know, it's a huge protest against vaccine mandates for truckers. The convoy part comes in as thousands and thousands of truckers move together from BC across the country to Ottawa, flying flags and huge signs protesting mandates. Thousands more people joined up along the way, and they all went to camp in Parliament Hill in the nation's capital. Now, this is where things get a little interesting. From day one, the government and media have been saying that this is a tiny majority of the Canadian public and just a fringe group. But looking at the numbers shows it's just not. I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but there's so much info about how the media is saying that the protesters are being aggressive and violent, stealing from homeless people, etc., etc. I mean, as with any protest, there are a few bad apples in it, but not nearly to the extent that it's being portrayed as. One last point I want to hit is that all along the Prime Minister has been saying that it's such a small group and that there's nothing to worry about. But the second that they get close to Ottawa, he conveniently has to isolate due to contact with a positive case of COVID. There's so much more here, guys, but I'll leave that talking up to you. You are more than welcome to use my voice in there. Thanks, boys.
And that is Canadian Trooper.
Oh, can I just say, we just got a thanks, boys. That's like a very Canadian, like Trailer Park Boys kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's my only, or like Letterkenny. Yes, I love that. We're the boys. We're like honorary Canadians.
You know what? I would love that. I would love to be an honorary citizen of most countries. But yes, Canadian Trooper, we are keeping the entirety of your message here. I'm going to use you as an example for the class. And I think this is something you can appreciate too as well, Matt. Canadian Trooper, at the very beginning of your message, you said, I didn't feel too comfortable, so I wrote some stuff down. I wrote a script. If you want to do that, then please feel free to do so. It's a great way to organize thoughts, and it'll also, at least for most people's experience, it'll also introduce some new ideas in your process when you're writing. Well, just for fun, I wanted to keep the part of the call where you say, oh shit, how do I turn this off? Because that one made my day. But he's raising some great points here, guys, because we're seeing a narrative war taking place regarding this convoy, which is being referred to as the Freedom Convoy. There are many disagreements regarding this. One of them, as you pointed out, Trooper, is the estimated size of the convoy overall. Now, make no mistake, obviously, not everybody in these protests are truckers. Also, there are a lot of concerns from people in Ottawa and from people abroad that this has echoes of the January 6th attack on the Capitol of the United States. And you can see why people would draw those parallels. We were talking off air about when to do an episode on this. And do we wait until more of the accurate information is solidified, or do we go with what we have now, knowing that things will probably change as this is a fluid situation? We haven't recorded the episode yet, but we did have some great research help. I went to Twitter, Ben Bolin HSW, as I do sometimes, just to get a sense of what our fellow listeners are thinking. And all I asked, I was trying to be very neutral about this, Matt, Noel. All I asked was Canadian/Canadian adjacent friends, what's your take on the trucker convoy protest Ottawa occupation? And from what we're hearing there from a lot of people in Canada, it seems like this is being regarded as a far right movement, or that's how it's being reported. What do you guys think about that?
The stuff that I've read, it's tough for me to know, Ben, I have to say, because of the reporting that I've read. It feels like things are being written about it in a negative light. But again, I don't know if that's from the perspective of the individual writers or the outlets or what. If you're looking at the actual news reporting on this thing, it definitely seems as though it's painted it in a negative light. I have heard from individuals on the ground who are taking part in, at least in the beginnings of this rally or of this protest. I would say that at least from what I understand from the individuals I spoke with, it was very much rooted in personal freedom against some kind of mandate relating to the vaccine. That's my understanding of it. That's what it was. That's what the core of it was.
Mm-hmm.
And it
So
was
there's no labor dispute at its heart in any shape or form? No.
It's not really a labor dispute. It's because you're talking about human beings that their job is to drive usually a large truck across the U.S.-Canadian border in some way.
Sure.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was going to be a mandate to have anyone who crosses that border on a regular basis as part of their job to have vaccines, specifically for the SARS-CoV-2, right?
Yeah.
That's how it began, at least. And it does feel like it was a thing that now has ballooned out that encompasses many other things. At least that's what I've gathered. Is that your sense?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because just for some quick numbers, it's important for us to establish that the majority of people working in the trucking industry in Canada are vaccinated, from what I can see, to the order of like 85%, 85 to 90%. You'll see. I think 85 is a little more believable number. So it is not as though the majority of the industry is powering this thing. A lot of non-truckers, as you mentioned at the top, have joined the protest for a number of reasons. There's always going to be mission creep whenever you get that many people together on a grassroots basis. Like if you look at the Occupy protests several years ago here in the US, they had the people in those protests had a growing number of goals, some of which were contradictory if you just looked at them on paper. So these protests make strange bedfellows, because what we're looking at is a Venn diagram, right, of different groups who may not agree with each other on everything else, but they're saying they don't want a vaccine mandate. They're getting heat in the news for being violent toward, I believe, homeless populations and things of that nature. But because this is an ongoing situation, even the best reporting is still going to suffer from a bit of a fog of war, because we're getting these conflicting statements, these conflicting agendas. It does remind us, though, of something we predicted a number of years back. And Matt, you brought this up off air. I can't remember when we said it. Okay, everybody get your shots ready. I can't remember if we talked about this on air or while we were hanging out one night, but we got to the conversation about. We did. Okay. Well, everybody spit the shot back into the glass. So we kidding. But so one of the points that we made was the importance of the trucking and shipping industries, right? You might not live in the world of trucking, you might not think it affects you, but if those groups ever decided to go on a nationwide strike, whatever country they are in would shut down. There's just no way around it. So
it sounds like even just physically pulling all their heavy duty trucks into one place is just causing pandemonium in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
People have been leaving Ottawa. Yeah.
They are large physical barriers that are mobile. Could be a problem.
You get a coordinated effort and you could probably encircle a whole city with those things.
Well, I mean, if you look at some of the photography coming out of the protests, it's astounding. Looking at downtown streets that are just filled with big rig trucks and no other traffic can get around. And I mean, it's effectively occupying large areas and shutting down commerce and just traffic in general.
Yeah, and there are also criticisms being leveled at law enforcement. There's here reports of arguments saying the police were much less likely to suppress or break up these protesters than they would, say, Black Lives Matter. And then that argument is being met with a counter argument on the part of law enforcement. It's true that this is happening. There are a ton of people in Ottawa right now, and they are protesting. Ultimately, at the very beginning, they're protesting the vaccine mandate in that country. However, as mission creep has crept, what we're seeing is increasing demands or increasing declarations, including some factions who are saying, let's overthrow the federal government. That's where the comparison to January 6th comes in. And for anyone who's ever dealt with the government, none of them are perfect. Nobody has gotten it right yet over the course of thousands of years. No one has made a perfect government and probably won't for a while, but it's still better than nothing. That's the problem. Like a lot of times, and this is just my perspective, but a lot of times when I hear people arguing for a world in which a federal government doesn't exist, or a country rather, they've never been to a failed state. They do not know what it's like to live in a place that does not have a government. It is ugly. It is dangerous. It is messy. And, I think for a lot of people, if you ever experience that, you're going to be much less irritated about the warts and the imperfections of your own government. With that being said, vaccine mandates, that's a whole other thing. We've had a lot of our fellow listeners write in some calling for more comprehensive mandates, and some people saying that it's, impinging upon their natural liberties. At this point, we're always very careful to be clear when we're talking about our own opinions rather than speculation or fact. But I was recently in a place that was requiring proof of vaccination to go to restaurants or to go to venues. And I loved it just because I like feeling like I'm somehow going through customs. You know what I mean? And that's just me. I don't have any science there. I just like when people ask me for a form and I have the form. I feel like I won. You know what I mean? I need a win.
So really worth it for all the waiting though, just for that one moment.
I don't know, man. It's like there's something about it. There's something about the bureaucracy.
No, you're right. It is satisfying once you get to pass through, but everything leading up to that, to me, is pure anxiety.
Right?
Because I always feel as though I've done something wrong, even though I definitely haven't. I assume that there's something that's going to go wrong, that my papers will not be in order, that I will have secretly stowed away with a kilo of cocaine that I'm unaware of, something like that.
Yeah. It's like whenever
nervous laughter, take a drink.
Whenever I hear a siren on the road anywhere, just for a second, I'm like convinced I'm running guns. And I just forgot about it. But then someone the anxiety is real. We're putting in some levity here because we know this is a very sensitive subject for a lot of people. And we endeavor to approach these things grounded in the world of fact and see if we can cut past the noise. Is there media bias in the reporting on these, on this convoy, on this occupation of Ottawa? Well, I mean, there's going to be some sort of bias, inevitably, because up to now, the journalists working on any story are going to be human beings, and human beings are inherently biased creatures. It's kind of an abstract point to make, though. It does remain an important one. If you read accounts of this in, say, Fox News, you're going to get a different slant than you would in, say, New York Times or Al Jazeera. And I was reading a lot of New York Times reporting on this, which I thought was excellent. You know what I mean? But for many people, a source like the New York Times is going to be considered worthless because they think it's already too left-leaning. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I just wanted to call back to something that our caller, Canadian Trooper, mentioned, just to it seems like it's some bad apples, but maybe it's more than that. And it reminds me of some of the Al Jazeera reporting where I'll just read a quote. Some protesters were seen waving Confederate or Nazi flags and insist the action will continue until COVID-related restrictions are lifted. A statement like that, some protesters were waving Confederate or Nazi flags, can't represent everybody, right? That's in that thing. But it is not a good look, and it's not a great thing. It's just how many is some? How, was it a couple of vans in the back, or was it a couple of the main trucks at the front of the lines? That would make a big difference. It's just that, and I'm not saying anything against the reporter. It's not a false statement. Some protesters were seen doing that. It's just it paints a picture in your mind as the reader of what this thing is about, maybe, right?
How many are some? Yeah. How much is a heap, right? These are tricky measurements. Yes.
Also, what does right wing in Canada mean the same thing as it means over here?
Yeah, generally.
Ideologically speaking?
Yeah. I mean, one of the main differences is you could say there's more of a prominent left-wing tendency in part of Canadian politics. Like for a European or an international audience, I don't want to ruffle feathers. These are just the facts. The average European or the average international audience, if they look at someone like current President Biden, they're not going to think of that guy as left wing. They're going to think of him as a center right politician, right, which by his actions, that's what his administration is. Yeah.
And the right wing party is called the People's Party of Canada. And in the Senate the Canadian Senate, there are 0 of 105 members that represent this party. Just to back up what you said.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So this, and also Canadian, the political apparatus is a little bit different from the U.S. You can read about it in depth. Just be prepared to, bring some coffee with you when you start reading about it, because it's not a page turner. So I'm trying to be diplomatic, but this is where we're at now, and it kind of goes into media responsibility, or your responsibility as a reader or a consumer of media. Yes, your brain is hardwired to tell you everything is awesome when you're reading stuff that confirms your existing opinion. As part of that little quirk is part of why humanity has been so popular so recently on the planet. It just works for people. But you have to fight against that, right? If you think you are very, very far right, or you think you're very, very far left, and you want to read or to learn more about a world event, you need to read the sources you don't like. You have to find a way to triangulate toward the truth. And it's work. It doesn't feel great, because your brain is going to be like, what's this information? This is not what we discussed earlier, and
it makes my brain hurt. I said a sentence earlier in this episode where I was like questioning whether or not reporting about, right extremists were being marginalized in this reporting. Like, that's insane. That hurts. That hurts my head. But you have to use your mind.
It's almost as though political correctness even extends toward being more friendly to fascists. It
sucks.
Ways, you know what I mean?
Well, that's why that's part of the work that you have to do. You can't read one thing and then take that as an article of faith. You know what I mean? You do have to. I always remember one of my favorite memes is just a photograph of graffiti, and it says in big letters, "Question everything." And then somebody came by later and wrote, "Why?" And that's the mentality you kind of have to take with you. So just to sew this up, because we're probably going to dive into this more in the future, I'd like to read some of the responses that I got on Twitter. And thank you to everybody who wrote in. Earlier we said, looking to learn more context. We tried to phrase that question very neutrally, so it didn't seem like we were priming people to respond a certain way. And Matt, Noel, and Mission Control and I do not live in Canada. Right. We have not lived in Ottawa. So we needed reports from people on the ground, which is what Matt was alluding to earlier. So Heather, longtime listener, Fracky Fire, you guys remember Heather, said that She is furious and worried and embarrassed on behalf of Canada. She says the convoy is run by the far right. It's part grift. It's part tantrum by, quote, giant babies who think putting on a mask is worse than killing people. Police response is in sharp contrast to what they do when First Nations people protest, the Indigenous communities in Canada. We had that echoed by several other people who were saying this was organized by far-right members. If you want to read more detail, you can go to my conversation there on Twitter.